Hi, today I thought we would do a bit of a flip through of a new book I got called Tape Leaders. This is a fantastic book, essentially a compendium of early British electronic music composers from the 50s and 60s. And it's in the form of a richly illustrated reference guide for anyone interested in electronic music and its origins in Great Britain. And it has a number of entries for each composer, including well-known composers such as Joe Meek, William Burroughs, and Brian Eno, to ultra-obscure composers such as Roy Cooper, Ranulph Glanville, and Edgar Vedder. There's also sections on EMS synths and the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. So let's take a look at this. This is a fantastic book from Ian Helliwell, and it's put out by Velocity Press in the UK. So if we start here with the first section, Electronic Music Composers A through Z. We start with David Allen, who was born in 1938 from Australia. Covers a lot of his life, some background on his works and his solo LPs. Barry Anderson from New Zealand. You can see here the nice 4-channel mixer image. He worked with the EMS Synthi at one point. Janet Beat from 1937 in her home studio. Childhood fascination with sounds on the countryside signaled the beginning of her lifelong interest in music, science, and the arts. Machine-made noises were also a formative influence, and the family engineering business and industry of the West Midlands opened up factory visits and first-hand exposure to the sounds of industrial processes. Harrison Birtwistle in 1934, known primarily for his instrumental works, he nonetheless included electronic tape in several other pieces, and in 1971 composed Chronometer, made purely from the sounds of various clock mechanisms, with Big Ben providing the central ostinato. Very interesting. These sounds were recorded and assembled by Zinoviev and analyzed by computer at EMS, with assistance from Peter Gragono. William S. Burroughs. Tape experiments, a number of those in the early 1960s, and he also recorded in Paris. And he is the grandson of inventor and founder of the Burroughs Adding Machine Company and nephew of publicist for the Rockefeller family. In 1944, he was living with Joan Vollmer and sharing with fellow writer Jack Kerouac. He actually became a heroin addict and was subsequently busted on a drugs charge and fled to Mexico. Very interesting. Gets into Tristram Cary here, who did some experimental studies in the 40s and 50s. He also worked at the VCS3, and he joined Peter Zinoviev and David Cockerell in forming EMS, and he developing the VCS3, the first British production synthesizer for which Tristram designed and built the prototype cabinet. Wow. That is so cool. Champion of British avant-garde tape music, he helped to promote and organize concerts, including electronic music programs at Queen Elizabeth Hall in 1968. He also made significant contributions to the Doctor Who series during its classic years in the 60s and 70s. He has a number of CDs out as well. Malcolm Clark, you can see here the Synthi 100. Did a piece called The Insect Play in 1961. And has also worked with Tristram Cary and a few others. He also joined the BBC Radiophonic Workshop in 1969. Cyril Klutz, or Klautz. A photo of him here in 1957. He's done a number of pieces. Again, also worked and visited at BBC Radiophonic Workshop. He's done pieces here called The Orders of Motion in 1963. He choreographed. He did have one of his pieces choreographed back in South Africa at the Space Theatre in Cape Town in 1974 as well. And here is Cyril and Rose Klautz in Brighton Beach, circa 1960. Here we have Terence Dwyer, who in the 1940s and 50s, he taught at schools in the Leicester area, and was a bit of a late starter, it says, with electronic and tape sounds, but he was into middle age before realizing there was a sizable gap in his largely self-taught, classically oriented musical knowledge. And he started devising projects for his students, for his art students. And he also visited the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. You can see here there's Composing with Tape Recorders, Musique Concrète for Beginners piece. I'm guessing it's some type of book that he put together. And then, of course, the seminal Brian Eno, who is from Woodbridge, Suffolk. His earliest electronic work was tape manipulations from 1966. A number of ambient works, of course. Music for Airports in 1978 signaled the start of ambient and the demise of obscure. And through the mid-70s, he released 4 pop-based albums, and following on from Robert Fripp, he collaborated with or produced many other groups and artists working in the rock and pop field, of course. Brian Eno is very well known. And from here we get into like Malcolm Fox. See here, he's performing. Ron Geeson, he's working on the Synthi A. Ken Gray, here's Ken with his electrosculpture. He is an audiovisual artist, kinetic sculptor, and teacher. And he prefers the term communications engineer rather than artist to convey the essence of his creative exploits. He created in 1976 for the Brighton Festival Phantasmagoria Today, a walk-in futuristic interactive environment with sculpture, lights, and electronic sounds activated by touch. Very cool. Ken Gray exhibiting his electrosculpture. Let's see here. A number of pieces, a number of shots. F.C. Judd with his earliest electronic work called The Butterfly in 1960, and here he is playing a prototype synthesizer. Look at this equipment. It's definitely vintage and definitely analog. Some nice photographs here. Images of Judd Rabilia. There's a magazine here, Practical Wireless PW Sound Effects Synthesizer. See on the Beach. Circuits for audio and tape recording, amateur tape recording. Some more music and lab equipment, and you can see here some sort of oscilloscope. And here he is working on tweaking. Looks like a mixer of some type. And this is his home studio in the late 50s, early 1960s. Wow. Look at this setup. That's pretty cool. George Newson from London. He taught himself to read music and play the piano. He was evacuated to Brighton during the Second World War. And then he went back to London at age 14 and received a scholarship to the Blackheath Conservatory of Music. Further studies, he started creating music for BBC Radio and their workshop, of course, Radiophonic Workshop. Spent time with Robert Moog at his Traumensburg factory and based himself at the University of Illinois, where he made his first tape composition, Silent Spring. Very cool. So he actually worked with Bob Moog. That's so neat. Don Banks, he secured a position as a lecturer in electronic music. Here he is, George Newsom, 1966. And the Phillips Pavilion in Expo 58. How neat is that? Daphne Oram, one of the true pioneers of early British electronic music. Oram studied piano, organ, and composition, and in 1942 turned down an offer of a place at the Royal College of Music. Instead, she opted for a job as junior studio engineer at BBC in London. And by the end of the 40s was pursuing her own investigations into experimental sound. You see here some nice photos. Daphne Oram and at Fred Judd's house in London in the 1950s, or 1960 I should say, 1960, here she is. York University Electronic Music Studio, early 1970s. Look at this gear. The console here. Some pieces here, you can see magazines and such, old photographs, the work of Malcolm Pointon. Peter Schmidt, earliest electronic work, A Painter's Use of Sound from 1967. And he moved to Britain as a child in 1938. Looks Looks like he was part of the UFO club as well in Tottenham Court Road. And he was appointed musical director for the Cybernetic Serendipity exhibition. He also met Brian Eno during the 60s, and the pair decided to collaborate on a set of instructions for creative decision-making. In 1975, they produced a set of 113 cards named Oblique Strategies. He also contributed artwork to several Eno albums of the mid-1970s, and they also worked on a special color light box in order to illuminate and apparently animate some of Schmidt's abstract paintings. That's really neat. You can see here some one of his works. VCS3, owned by Edward Williams from Surrey, and his link with the synthesizer EMS manufacturer, of course, became much greater after the company went bankrupt in '79, and he stepped in and took control in 1984. That year, he worked with EMS designer Richard Monkhouse and commissioned the ultrasonic movement reactive device, Soundbeam, which was initially developed for use by modern dancers to generate electronic sounds in live performance. Peter Zinoviev needs no introduction. Born to aristocratic Russian parents who had met in London after emigrating. So he established a well-equipped studio in his back garden in Putney, overlooking the Thames, in 1965, where he met Delia Derbyshire and Brian Hodgson and formed Unit Delta Plus. And they started getting into computers, purchased his first DEC PDP 8/S computer, costed around £4,800, and it was the only one to be privately owned in Britain. You can see here some photos, of course. The Synthi 100, VCS3, experimental amateurs. There's a number of amateurs in this section, of course. Top of the tapes, so goes through some clippings and whatnot. Touches on folks like Dennis Affleck, Ralph Broom, Paul Carnell. Here's a 35mm slide montage, again by Ian Helliwell, who's the author of this book, this fantastic flip through of music, as we're seeing here, and electronics. Steve Duckworth, another amateur, who here is his studio early to mid-1970s. You can see here he's got EMS gear and some tape recording equipment. Some montage. Stuart Wynne-Jones at work with stills from Short Spell, The Spark and the Rejected Rose. Animated pieces. And there's some additional amateurs here with electronic music interest. A number of folks. Then we get to electronic music groups. A lot of these worked with things such as the EMS VCS3 and Synthi A modules in the 70s. And here you can see there's an ad for the VCS3 itself. The Beatles, of course, need no introduction, from Liverpool and at Abbey Road Studios in London. They experimented with tape, and it began in the sessions for the Revolver LP in 1966. All group members had access to reel-to-reel recorders for making loops. And tapes can be heard on a number of tracks, and particularly Tomorrow Never Knows, which features vocals fed through a Hammond organ Leslie speaker and noise effects from tape loops. Very cool. George Harrison's modular Moog synthesizer, patched and programmed by Mike Vickers, was utilized effectively on a number of tracks for the Beatles' Abbey Road album in August 1969. It stands out during tremendous white noise finale on I Want You, She's So Heavy. Hawkwind. They had an extended and regularly shifting lineup, including vocalist and poet Robert Calvert, bassist Lemmy, of course, projections from Liquid Len, a dancer Stacia, sci-fi writer Michael Moorcock, and Del Detmar on EMS VCS3 synthesizer. Very cool. A few others, Music Plus, Naked Software, and Quiet Pavement Ensemble, as well as Unit Delta Plus, which was a venture for supplying electronic music commercially as well as in lectures and presentations. It was a collaboration between Delia Derbyshire, Brian Hodgson, and Peter Zinoviev. Started in the mid-60s. Section of Peter Zinoviev's Deodar Road Studio. White Noise from London. And then lastly, we get to, well, not lastly, but EMS Electronic Music Studios itself. Really cool. So this was a pioneering computer-controlled studio and leading synthesizer manufacturer, of course, and EMS played a significant part in early British electronic music. Known across the world for its innovative products, from the early 60s, Peter Zinoviev had been building up his own collection of electronic music equipment and continuing at his home in Putney. And we see here, every picnic needs a Synthi. And here's the studio in 1973 with Jim Lawson, John Holbrook, Peter Zinoviev, and Tristram Carey inside working away. See here as well, EMS Synthi 100. We see here the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which was officially opened on the 1st of April 1958. And a number of producers proposed that experimental work should be conducted for its own sake without necessarily being used for broadcast. Daphne Oram had been pressing for such a unit for most of the 1950s, and along with her fellow studio manager Desmond Briscoe, were able to help make this a reality. You can see here a number of folks who were integral to this and composers who had joined the unit over the years. And of course, EMS synthesizers were a big player in that studio. Tape leaders, early electronic music CD from Britain. There's a CD with this book. So some track notes here at the end. Various composers. And then of course there's information, credits, and index towards the end here, with a personal account by Deidre Piper. Really cool. And then of course Ian Helliwell himself, the author of this book, has a piece on himself here. And, you know, he started life in the northeast of England, spent early years growing up in Durham. He formed a group called Giant Clams in 1988, first working with a 4-track cassette recorder, making initial experiments with tape echo units and reel-to-reel tape loops. He eventually developed techniques for rewiring 9-volt sound generating kits, and from early 90s continued to the present day, he has constructed a unique range of machines, including a series of Helitron tone generators and Helisizer synths. Huh, very neat. And here we can see some of his equipment that he's built himself. Home studio with equipment built by Ian Helliwell. How neat is that? Wow. Right on. So that is Tape Leaders by Ian Helliwell from Velocity Press, which I highly recommend if you're into abstract, old electronic music, history, especially from England, tape music, musique concrète, you know, not sort of traditional music, but more experimental. This is a fantastic book, which I definitely think is worth picking up. There's so much information and research that's been put into this book. It's quite incredible, and Ian Helliwell is to be commended for his efforts in putting this book together. It is quite a compendium, as it says here, of early British electronic music composers. And he's definitely drawn on his experience and research into this field So it took him 6 years and dozens of interviews to amass the information in this book, never before brought to light on this subject. So absolutely fascinating stuff. Really glad I checked it out. And if you guys are interested, definitely, hit up Velocity Press. Their website will be displayed down below, and you can get your own copy. There's lots to absorb and look through in this book, as you just saw. But it really takes time to go through it all. So I would definitely recommend grabbing a copy for yourself if you're interested in this type of material. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this little walkthrough and flip through of this great book. And we'll talk to you again soon. And feel free to leave a comment, a like, and subscribe if you haven't to the channel. Make sure you tap the bell on the way out. So thanks a lot, guys. We'll talk to you again soon. And thanks as well to Ian Helliwell and Velocity Press for putting together Tape Leaders. Fantastic book. Take care.